Welcome to another month of Skill Builders. This month, Joanne and I will be covering a variety of techniques, some new and several from previous projects. We'll use pattern to boundary, repeat patterns with center reference and a rotation angle, plus 2 alternate ways to place a pattern and rotate it, nodes to divide a no-sew, place a fill pattern using circular array, combine and save a pattern, repeat patterns using both locks on and off, reverse, start and end. Phew, so many different techniques in such a small project. Joanne, let's play.
Thanks, Joyce. You're right. This little project does have a lot going on. Summer is such a busy time, and we packed this one full of little ideas and techniques for you, so it's just in time for you to hang for 4th of July, or you can do the alternate version for that special birthday that's coming up. So let's go ahead and get started.
This little banner is small enough that you are able to get the whole thing in on your quilting area, so that means you can baste it all the way around at one time, which will really stabilize it. The next thing that I decided to do was my stitch in the ditch. It really made for a much cleaner project, and if you will notice, you can do stitch in the ditch with channel lock on. So what I did was think about how is the best way to do the stitch in the ditch on these stripes to keep them nice and straight and do less stops and starts. So I started with channel lock on a 90-degree, and I went this direction, clicking as many times as I wanted to. Then I came down this side of this blue block and back to the ending on this side. So this is what I did. The good news about that is you are stitching in the ditch on both sides of the white, which means you are automatically doing the stitch in the ditch on the red. If I go back to draw line and I click on this part right here, and I tell Creative Studio to give me channel lock because I'm doing this with the head of the machine. When I get to this point right here with my clicking, all I have to do is left click or hit my top mode button on flip channel lock, and you will see in the bottom of the taskbar it automatically flips that channel lock to a 90 degrees, and now I can make sure that I'm a 90 degrees going down the side of that blue block, hit my flip channel again on my keypad, and now I will have a channel lock in a 0 degrees going back along the white stripe. So that's the way that you flip the angle on the channel lock from the head of the machine. It makes it much more efficient and much easier for you to do that. So that's the first thing that I did, was the stitch in the ditch around these stripes. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to draw a boundary of this blue block, and I'm going to quilt it first. And I'm going to show you the 3 different ways to be able to put this star pattern right here in the center of that boundary. So let's get started with that. I'm going to open up a new quilt group because this is the quilt group that my image is in. So I'm going to go to a new quilt group, and I am going to click out a boundary. Let me change over to my project tab because I need to be working from my project tab. All of the patterns are already loaded for you. I'm going to click out a boundary to be able to put in this frame right here. What you're going to get this month are 2 frames. Let me show you the difference in the 2. The one on the left that I have selected does not have an inside channel digitized into it the way the one on the right does. Echo will fight you sometimes, so what Joyce decided to do was go ahead and put that channel in there for you instead of you having to mess with Echo. This is the one that we're going to be using, the one that has the channel on it. because we're going to need to use it for fill. I'm going to delete these. I'm going to draw that boundary. I'm going to make sure that I have the correct pattern selected. If you're not sure which one of these frame patterns you're supposed to use, you can just hover over them once you get out of draw boundary, and it will tell you the name of the pattern, and the one with the echo frame is the one that we want. So we're going to select our boundary. We're going to make sure that we are on standard pattern to boundary, and we're going to left click on pattern to boundary, and Creative Studio is going to pull that pattern in there for you. I like mine to be a little bit closer, so I'm going to switch to orange handles, and I'm going to pull it out ever so slightly because I just like to fill up the space. This is the first pattern that we're going to quilt out, so I'm going to do this for you. When you're working on anything custom, you need to think about how best to quilt that out, the order of the patterns that you're going to quilt. We quilted the frame first because that stabilizes the block. The next thing that we're going to quilt is this star pattern right here, and there's a couple of different ways to be able to place it in a boundary. You already know that we can select the boundary and we can left click on pattern to boundary, and it places that star, but it is not the right size because Creative Studio is doing its best to honor the margin that we set. We would need to select our pattern, go to F10 handles, and just pull it in because pattern to boundary will place that pattern in the center. That's one way you can do it. I'm going to hit my little X and delete this pattern. The other way that you can place it is to drag the pattern over to the place on the computer screen that you would want it. In a perfect situation, this pattern would come in exactly the size that it needs to be. You can see that it is quilting over into the frame right here, and the reason that it's doing that is because this frame pattern is at 11.45, but yet the actual pattern, if I hit the letter P on my keyboard, is 1188. So this star pattern would fit 11.88, but it doesn't quite match up to 11.45. So in that case, you would still need to use your F10 handles to be able to size the pattern. The issue with that is when you drag something over, I can see that I'm a little bit closer on this right side than the left side, and I don't really have any idea about north and south because I just drug the pattern over. So I'm going to delete that pattern, and we're going to go back to the method that we used last month of drawing an X boundary into this block. So I'm going to go to draw boundary, and with the head of my machine, because this frame could have caused some shrinkage, I'm going to click out this X boundary. I'm going to go from the upper left to the bottom right, up to the upper right, down to the bottom left, and then hit close, and it's going to make that X in that boundary. I have my X. I'm going to select my pattern. I'm going to repeat patterns, and I'm going to change the point type to center, and I am going to left click right here in the center of that X that I drew. I'm going to say OK, and once again I am going to select this pattern and go to F10 handles, and I'm going to shrink it down just a little bit to make sure that it is not quilting on any part of that frame. This is a banner that we're doing. So in this case, the banner, even though we're quilting it horizontal, it would hang vertical. So what that means is we need to select this star, and we have a couple of different ways that we can rotate it. If I hit my space bar one time, then that rotates that star, and now it is to where the banner can be hung vertically if you're going to use it as a banner. If you're not going to use it as a banner, then you could leave it in there the way that it was to start with. I can also go to the selected pattern properties and this angle right here and put in a 90, and that would also rotate the pattern around. I'm going to hit Control Z one more time, and notice when I hit Control Z, it put that pattern back to the original size. So you want to be careful with that whenever you're playing with it. I can right click on the pattern. I can left click on rotate 90 degrees because that is my right click pattern menu, and that rotates the pattern 90 degrees. To me, the easiest way to do it, I have the pattern selected because I'm going to size it the way I need it to be sized, is just to hit the space bar one time. And if you do that, it automatically rotates that pattern 90 degrees. So I'm going to quilt this out, and I have stitching points on because I want it to be nice sharp points in all of these areas. Once I get that quilted out, and I've used white thread for the frame and I'm using white thread for the star, the fill in the background I am going to use a blue thread because I want that just to be texture. So hold on just a minute and let me quilt this out, and then I'll come right back to you. Now it's time to put the fill in. If I drag this pattern over now and I tell it to fill in this particular area right here, Creative Studio is not going to be successful. And the reason that it's not going to be successful is because I have too many boundaries here. You see what happens whenever I click on fill? It goes all the way around and comes to this different part. All of that yellow is a pattern that is going to quilt, and that's just ugly. So I'm going to hit delete. The thing to remember with fill is usually the part that you do not want to quilt in is in the center of your block. So patterns that quilt to the center and back out again, or either from the center and out and back in, the way that this pattern does, if I do virtual stitch out for you, I'm going to hit the plus key and speed it up. These are the patterns that are going to be most successful, not the ones that stitch left to right. The pattern either needs to start at the outside and go in, or it needs to start at the inside and go out. Fill works off of boundaries. So in this case, we have boundaries that are touching other boundaries, and fill is not going to be successful doing that. We also have a lot of different things going on here with the different patterns. So it may be difficult to select this pattern with all of this going on. So this is what you want to do. Select your frame pattern, and we're going to do nodes. We're going to divide this frame out, and what I want you to see is anything that is a pink node is a dividing node. Anything that is a blue node is a manipulating node. And because Echo is a little bit fussy sometimes, this pattern already has a built-in channel. If I select the pattern and I toggle the pattern as unsewn, this is your indication right here as to where that jump stitch is. You see this teal marker right here, and you see this green marker right here? That tells you that's where the jump stitch is on that pattern. There is not a lot of guesswork there. If I select the pattern and I go to nodes and I scroll in really close, anything that is a heavy pink node means that that's an intersection. And it usually means that there is more than one node in that location. You see how close I'm scrolling in? And you can see that there are two pink nodes there. The other thing that indicates, other than the markers where the jump stitch is you're going to have a long blue line that goes from the ending point of the first pattern to the beginning point of the second pattern. If I hover over the node, and there's several different ways to do this. I like to hit the letter D on my keyboard because my hand is already on the mouse, and that's the shortcut to hit the letter D. You can also right click, and there is your divide menu, and left click on divide, but that seems like an extra step to me. So what I have done with just one click is I have divided out this frame pattern and turned it into two patterns. We've already quilted the frame, so I'm going to get rid of that, and I am going to select the echo or the channel, and I'm going to convert it pattern to boundary. Just that fast. I'm going to do the same thing with this one. If it's easier for you to toggle it unsewn, that shows you where your jump stitch is. So I'm going to either go back to nodes, or I'm going to hit my F7, and I know that the inside quilted second, and that's what tells me that's the node that I need to hover over, and I need to hit my divide right there. Now remember, on the channel we got rid of the outside. On the star we want to get rid of the inside because we want our rays to fill in between the outside of the star and the inside of the frame. I'm going to select the frame, and I am going to convert that pattern to boundary. This very first boundary that we had, because we have to start getting rid of some boundaries, is selected. I'm going to hit the word delete on my keyboard. But if I do that, that's going to leave me with just the X. So now I can take my pattern, and that's a real easy way to find where the center is to be able to place that pattern. That's what I want to do. I want this pattern to be underneath the star boundary and underneath the frame boundary, but I want to have this part right here. I need it in all four corners. So I'm going to select the ray, the corner rays fill, and I'm going to go to circular ray and left click. Now Creative Studio thinks that these patterns are connected, and that's why it put them in this position. I do want 4 copies, and I do want them at 90 degrees, but I need them to be placed next to each other. In order to do that, I have to uncheck connect. You want to make sure that snap is off. I'm going to hover over that blue dot, and I'm going to hold down my left mouse key, and I am going to put those rays right there on that X boundary that I drew, just like that. I'm going to left click on OK, and now I have done circular ray with those patterns. I need to delete the X boundary because Creative Studio will not fill this successfully unless I get rid of that boundary. Hit my letter K on my keyboard to cycle through my boundaries. Hit the word delete on my keyboard, and that leaves me with 2 boundaries that are not touching and my rays. And you look at how pretty those rays go into that corner right there. All I have to do now is select all of my rays. Your boundary does not need to be selected. I'm going to left click on fill inside, and now Creative Studio will fill that area that is around the star. What it also did was create a little bit of a stitch in the ditch around that star. So you want to slow this pattern down and be real careful whenever you go around there. In order to do that, I'm going to select it. I'm going to hit the letter I, and you can see that it is stitching at 11 speed, which is way too fast. So I'm going to change that to a 2 and hit Save and Close. What Creative Studio also does, it will not connect the ending part of this pattern with the starting point of the pattern. If it were a pattern that I wanted Creative Studio to do the stitch in the ditch with, I would then go to Draw Line, and I would do Draw Line right along this V, and now I would have a complete stitch in the ditch around the star. I don't have to do that because the star is already quilted. So I won't do that on that particular one. But I'm going to quilt this out, and I'm going to be real careful to watch to make sure that it just taps that frame. If I do virtual stitch out, you can see that. I want it just to tap that frame and come back down again. What I've got to be careful of is what it does around the star. So this is what you ended up with whenever you get through quilting that. That's where our channel is, if I can make this match up. You see what the shrinkage was on that? I'm going to pull this in and make it match and pull this up just like this. This is what we ended up with on our block, with our star in the middle. And remember, we rotated that star to be able to have it fit and not hit any of that stitching in that channel. So this is our block that we have that is in the middle. The only thing that we have left to do is to go over and quilt out our stripes.
For our little banner, we only had one block to do for the star. That's all that we had, was this one right here. And we went through several steps to be able to do that. We had the frame, then we had to divide out the channel on the frame. We had the star to do, and we had to divide out the outside edge of the star, and then we had to do circular ray and do the fill on the inside between the star and the frame. So that was several steps that we had to do, and that's not any big deal for just one block on a quilt. However, if you had a quilt that had 15, 20, or whatever number of these blocks to do, it would be a little tedious to do that every single time. So in order to do a much easier, faster way, if you had multiple blocks, what we would do then is select all of these patterns that we did. I'm going to move them down right here so you can see them a little better. Select each one of those patterns. They're already in the correct sewing order. You do have jump stitches in here, and that's okay. We want them to be jump stitches. But we would select all of these patterns, and we would save this pattern by doing a right click and going down to Save Pattern and a left click, or going to your File drop down and Save Pattern As. We do want it to be all of the patterns. This is the new Save dialog box for version 7 in Creative Studio. You're going to have parent patterns right down here at the bottom, and you see it recognizes all 3 patterns that we used to put together this one block. It is a block type pattern. It does say Joyce Lundrigan because she was the designer of the pattern, and I do have it in a collection that is Skill Builders 1906 for June of 19, and Joyce Lundrigan as my designer. And I put a 01 in front of my designers so they will come to the top of my collection list. You also have the default of database checked and project checked. because Creative Studio is going to assume that you want to add this pattern to your database and you want to add it to your project because you need to use it right then. In previous versions of Creative Studio, we would save the pattern to a file, but we don't need to do that any longer. We can save it straight to that database and that project. I would keep the name the same as it is, but I would add the word block to it. And the reason that I would add the word block is because I already have a pattern that is SB star swirl echo frame. I want to signify that this is the block pattern with all three of those patterns combined. I'm going to then hit Save and Close. And you can see that there is that pattern right at the top of my pattern list in my project. It will also be in my pattern database under my pattern tab. And because I sort newest patterns first, right after all of these favorites that I have tagged, you should see that pattern, and there it is right there. Because this pattern is one that I just got through doing, I can select it and do a right click, and I can sync that single pattern up to the cloud, and when I do that, it will be backed up into my cloud. I don't have to wait until a full backup to be able to save that pattern to my cloud. Now that we have that pattern saved, when we do our additional blocks, we would simply draw a boundary. Let me get it away from there and draw it for you. And I'm going to cheat and turn on my grid snap. On whatever quilt that you're doing, you would draw the boundary. The boundary is selected, and now we can just say pattern to boundary, and Creative Studio will place that pattern in the boundary. It's a lot easier if you have multiple blocks to do. And you may want to go ahead and save this pattern as a block pattern because it is a really good pattern that you can use for something else regardless of what it is. So that's what you would do in order to save the pattern and save you some time whenever you are placing that into future blocks. So now you have a new pattern to add to your database from the June Skill Builders.
In order to do the stripes, I am going to go to a new quilt group. So I'm going to go to this quilt group right here, and what I'm going to do first is the top stripe. I'm going to do the red ones first, and there are 3 of them. And for that, we're going to use a pattern that you already own. It is in your Statler Stitcher patterns. So I'm going to go to patterns, and I'm going to type in the word curve and hit enter. And Creative Studio is going to bring up all of the patterns that either have the word curve in them, they are tagged curve, they are in a collection that has curve. That's what it's going to look for whenever it searches for that. And you have one called P2P curve. I'm going to hit the P on my keyboard. And when you go to tags, you can see that it says Creative Studio and QLI. That's what it was tagged by Statler whenever you got that pattern. We're going to use that pattern right there to place in these red stripes. So I'm going to go to my stripes quilt group, and the first thing that I'm going to do is draw out a boundary to know how much space that I have. When you are doing Stitch in the Ditch, you would click on the low side of the seam. When I'm doing boundary, I'm going to click on the high side of the seam. And I'm clicking on that basting line. So here is my stripe right here. If I do not remember what this width is, I can select that boundary and I can convert it pattern to boundary. Then I can select that, and it tells me that my width is 30.37 inches. That way I do not have to measure that. I'm going to convert it back again. My crosshair is in the upper left. I'm going to select my pattern and I'm going to go to Repeat Patterns. See, this is still selected down here. That 30.37 is still active even though I converted this back to a boundary. So I'm going to left click on Repeat Patterns. That's going to go away. Upper left is my reference. I can say OK, and Creative Studio is going to place one pattern. It's way too big. So I'm going to tell Creative Studio to give me, say, a 1/2 inch on that pattern. And it makes it smaller and it sizes it symmetrically. Now my width was 30.37. Enter that. Move my mouse to the screen, and that puts in my first row of that pattern. This was locked on total size. Now I am going to lock my repeats, and I'm going to tell Creative Studio to give me 3 rows. Just like that. So in this case, we are using both locks in Repeat Patterns. The first lock we did to be able to get our width, the number of repeats that we needed. The second one was we locked the rows and said, give me 3 rows. And I'm going to say, OK. What Creative Studio is going to do now, and I'm going to take these and I'm going to nudge them down a little bit because I want them to be a little bit more evenly spaced in that boundary. And I'm going to nudge them over just a little bit. What Creative Studio is going to do now, and what the markers tell us, is it's going to sew left to right on the first row, come back and start the second row and sew left to right, and then start the next row and sew left to right. And that's not what we want. We want this to sew continuously without stopping, because remember, on this right side over here is our binding area. So what I'm going to do is think about how I can have this first row to sew left to right, then come down and sew right to left on the next row, and then left to right again on the bottom row. And I'm going to make Creative Studio do the work for me. Doing a marquee select from left to right. Remember, I have to have every part of the pattern for Creative Studio to select that pattern. Holding down my left mouse key and dragging a rectangular box left to right. Let go of my mouse, and you can see that I only have 1 row selected. If I left click on reverse start and end, it's going to give me an error message, because remember, I had 8 repeats going along this row. That is not one pattern. That is 8 repeats of the one pattern. So I am going to left click on combine pattern. It unselects it, but all I have to do is just left click on it, and now I can reverse the start and end. What Creative Studio is going to do now, I'm going to run Virtual Stitch Out for you. It's going to start on the left side. I'm going to speed up Virtual Stitch Out, drop down to the second row, and it's going to go right to left and then do the third row. I still have these jumps on this side, but now if I marquee select from right to left, and I tell Creative Studio to fill inside, that makes that one pattern. And when I do Virtual Stitch Out now, you're going to see that it sews left to right. It sews a straight line in the binding area, and then it goes back and sews right to left. This little side right here is where you want to slow down Creative Studio whenever you get to that side. And I did a terrible job of clicking that boundary. But if I slow down Creative Studio when I get to that side, then it should hit right there in that ditch. So let me quilt that one out for you. Because I'm using blue thread, I want to do each of the red stripes first, because that way I don't have to change thread, and then I can go back and do the off-white stripes. These stripes are already stitched in the ditch, so they're already stabilized. Now we need to figure out an easy way to be able to put this pattern in the next boundary, and I've already drawn that boundary for you. We did repeat patterns with the first one. We had to reverse the start and end of the second row. We had to go through several steps to be able to do that. We already have all of that done. So what we're going to do for this stripe is we're going to take this pattern and we are simply going to do copy. Your shortcut is Control-C, and then we're going to say paste and left click on paste, and we're going to place that pattern right here in that stripe. Left click to paste it, right click to stop that action, and just that easy, I have placed that pattern in this next stripe. If it doesn't quite fit, you see how it goes outside the boundary right over here? All I have to do is make sure that I'm correct on this end, and I am. Select the pattern, tell Creative Studio to fill inside, and it adjusts that left side to fit like we need it to fit. Make sure that your pattern is centered in the stripe the way that you want it to be. You can nudge it up a little bit or nudge it down a little bit, but do any of that, and just in the space of just a couple of seconds, I have now placed that next stripe and I'm ready to quilt that out. I would do that with the next stripe as well. Staying with the blue thread and do these boundaries and place those patterns in there. Just that quick and just that easy. This pattern is sewn. My next boundary is drawn out. Creative Studio will hold this pattern in my clipboard, just like a Windows clipboard, until I'm ready to use it again. If I had done a rubber stamp on this pattern, you would have to rubber stamp it, and when you right click, rubber stamp is done and it's finished. So in order to rubber stamp it again, I would have to go back and select the pattern and rubber stamp it. Rubber stamp is also group specific, which means that I cannot go over to this group and rubber stamp that pattern over here. With copy and paste, it is not group specific, and it, like I said, holds that pattern on that clipboard until I'm ready to use it. So I could go back to my star block group, left click on paste, and there are my stripes right there. I don't have to worry about these extra patterns on the computer screen as you would with rubber stamp. I'm going to left click on paste. I'm going to pull this next pattern in, place it to where I think that it's symmetrical. I am looking to see and make sure that these patterns are fitting the way they need to fit. I would nudge this one over a little bit, hold down my Alt key, and left click, gently tapping my arrow key on my keyboard. That puts this pattern, you see the difference in this boundary and this boundary here? I am going to say fill inside, and when I say fill inside, it cleans up the edges of that pattern exactly the way that I need it to do. So now this one is ready to quilt out. Just making Creative Studio do the work for you. Once I get this one quilted, then I'm going to go back in and do the off-white stripes. So let me do this one. This little project is just so fast and easy, but it has a lot of lessons in it. with doing this custom, what I would do now is select these boundaries by hitting my K key and then hit the word delete on my keyboard and delete these boundaries, because for these stripes in the middle, I want to have accurate boundaries for them. I don't want to be confused between the visual of these other three boundaries still up here. So let me draw this boundary for this first one, and I'll show you a different way to put the next pattern in. We'll be using this SBP star, so that's your hint on that one. So let me get this boundary drawn. I drew my boundary. The next thing that I'm going to do is select draw line, and I'm going to draw a line, and I am using my mouse from the left side of this boundary to the right side of the boundary. What's important on this particular one, that line is not straight. I did not draw it straight. If I were drawing with the head of the machine and doing draw line with that, I could do channel lock if I want to. However, what I can do with the line selected is I can change the angle to 0, and if you watch really close, you'll see that line move ever so slightly to put it at a 0 angle. It has a 0 height, so I know I have it at a 0 angle. This pattern, I'm not real sure where to draw the line, because the start and end is not exactly in the center, but it's also not at the base of the pattern. So I'm going to select my line, and I'm going to left click on apply pattern, and I got pretty close. I'm going to delete my line. I'm going to select my patterns, and I'm going to use my nudge, and I'm going to nudge them down ever so slightly. They're a little bit tall, so because I have them all selected, I can just use my F9 handle and move those patterns down just like that, and I can live with that. I'm going to change to a 1/4 inch on my grid size, and you can see that this pattern comes really close to touching that line, and it comes close to touching the line up there. So in other words, I am filling up that boundary and being able to place those patterns in there. I didn't have to go to repeat patterns and find the width and do the measuring. I let apply do the work for me. So let me quilt those out, and I'll show you how easy it is to quilt out the next ones. Now I need to place those stars in this next boundary. We looked at where they were positioned. This time, instead of doing copy and paste, I'm going to recycle what I already have. So I'm going to select these patterns as a whole, and I'm going to move them down and put them right here in this boundary, just like this. This way, they are still individual patterns, and I can adjust them any way that I want to adjust them. I'm going to scroll in. I probably want them to be just a little bit closer to be off of the top. I need to toggle them as unsewn. The advantage to selecting the patterns and moving them down is they are all individual patterns still. If you do copy and paste, then all of these patterns would be combined. So I'm going to quilt these out, and then I'm going to draw that last boundary, take those patterns and place them in that last boundary and quilt those out. And I have one more little trick for you, and then this little banner will be done. This stripe is just a repeat of the last one. Selecting my patterns, dragging them down to this position. I'm using my grid to make sure that they're lined up the way that I want them to be lined up. I am going to toggle them as unsewn, and I can select them all to do that. I can adjust them as I need to because they are individual patterns. If I want to make one just a little bit taller to be able to fit into my boundary a little bit better, That little bit of change right there is really not going to be noticeable on a visual. I've got our little banner quilted out, and like I said, it was a quick, fast project with lots of lessons. One of the things that I like so much about copy and paste is if you have customers, it is really impressive to be able to show them what their quilting looks like on their quilt. So in order to do that, I'm going to take these star patterns and I'm going to copy them, and I am going to paste them back in the stripes and in the boundaries that we had before, just like that. Now I'm going to select all of these patterns and I am going to copy them once again. And I'm going to go over to my star block. Let's get rid of this, that quilt group, and I'm going to hit paste, and I'm going to place those patterns right here like this. Let me change my grid so it's easier for you to see, and hit my letter C. Now I have the whole look of the banner, and I can see what it's going to look like when I'm finished. I always did this on every customer quilt. I made a quilting mock-up, and it was always the first quilt group of whatever I was quilting for that customer, so that whenever they got through looking at their quilt, they can then see what the quilting patterns look like as well. And I think if you try this, I think you will find that they will be real happy with being able to see that. Our little quilt banner is done.
Joanne, that sure was a fun and quick little project filled with a lot of information. We included a cupcake motif as one idea that could be used as a birthday banner, and I can't wait to see the other variations that people come up with.